Many people have asked me to share my story with them. They've heard it before, but they wanted to hear it from me. And as I tell it, I watch their eyes to see how much of it they believe. Over the last decade, I've told this story so many times. My son has heard it. He could probably tell it better than I could by now. And I will tell it to you, but I want you to know there are certain parts that I still don't understand and won't do it justice by the retelling. My name is Meshach, hasn't always been that. I grew up as Mishael in Jerusalem. Every memory I have of childhood is good. My family was pretty well off, so we had a comfortable life. I did well in school. I wasn't as athletic or outgoing as my bigger brother, and I didn't get all the attention that my little sister got. I was kind of Mishael in the middle. Quiet, rather be by myself a lot of the time. A little more pensive, a little more maybe poetic than some other people, but it was just a really good childhood growing up and a good day in Jerusalem until I was 15. On my 15th birthday, my father died. Now, if you've ever experienced a loss, you know a death like that marks your calendar for the rest of your life. You know when that time comes. But when it falls like a ton of bricks on a good day, it just devastates you in a special way. If only that had been the worst of it, but that was actually just the beginning of the collapse. 6 months later is when things really started to fall apart. I wasn't very involved in the political news of the day, but everybody had heard rumors of Nebuchadnezzar. And we had seen our nation's neighbors falling to his rule, and we knew we were probably just a matter of time. And so that anxiety was the silent conversation beneath every conversation. It was on the back of everybody's minds, Nebuchadnezzar and his army, until one day they were at the gates. The dread had come, and everybody's fear turned to panic. My brother and I climbed as high as we could get. We looked over the walls, and all we could see is a sea of soldiers. My heart stopped beating. Sitting inside that city, I thought we were pretty much ants on the side of a flooding river, and we were about to be washed away by the dirty water. And we were everybody else scrambling, not really knowing what to do in a moment like this. There were a few people running around town like prophets, telling everybody, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. The Lord is with you. The Holy One will protect you. Have faith, don't fear. But all I could do was be afraid. My mom grabbed us kids, and we went into the house and hid in the shadows, and she put her arms around us, and we just prayed quietly. And we prayed that by some miracle they may miss our house, and we could hear the thundering footsteps, and we could hear the screams, and they didn't miss us. They dragged us out of the house like everybody else, and it was pandemonium in the streets. And before I even knew how, I was bound and being dragged away by soldiers. My brother was bound and being dragged in a different direction. I looked back to see my mother standing in front of our doorstep, grabbing my sister by the wrist and refusing to let go as the soldiers pulled at my sister's other arm, and they were screaming at her, let her go, let her go. And my mom did not speak. She just stood, and her eyes spoke for her, and she said, I will never let her go. Last thing I saw was a soldier barely older than me knock her to the floor, grab my sister, and take her away. It's the last I saw of any of them. I wish I would have put up more of a fight, but I was just frozen. They dragged us out of the city, and the farther we got out of the city, we became part of this faceless mass, just gobs of people. And I remember whispering one last prayer as we left the walls, God save me. But When we got into the group, we were like cattle. No individual, just cattle, a mass that got prodded and poked toward Babylon. And so we started this long march. And as we started this long march, everything just started to get more painful day after day, walking all day. No encouragement, no good meals, barely enough to survive, no comfortable sleeping environments. We marched and we marched and we marched, and it got to the point where, everything's hurting so much that each step hurts worse than the last one. And the tragedy of what has happened to my entire life started to sink in until one day it just stopped. You know how your body just says that's enough pain and it shuts it off? That's what happened. Everything went numb. Numb feet. Numb mind. Heart. And we walked. Day after day, until finally whispers and rumors started among the group that we were close to Babylon. And as we got closer and closer, you could see it from a distance, and it shined. It was a beautiful city. We came up to the gates, which were just full of, it was marvelous. I mean, is it strange that I was so intrigued by a city that destroyed my city? I felt guilty for being so in awe, but the wall was amazing. The colors were unbelievable. The architecture was just fantastic. And we walked through this city, and it was all kinds of strange, but it was alive. It was buzzing. And we got quickly sorted and shifted into groups. And we were in the great Babylon. We didn't see Nebuchadnezzar. Rarely people like me get to see Nebuchadnezzar, but we knew you could feel him. Anywhere you went in the city, you could feel his presence, his shadow kind of cast over the entire city. His dominance was kind of echoing in the corners of the street at night. And we knew we were now under his rule, whether or not we wanted to be. The group that I got sifted and sorted into was actually a welcome change, because as I got moved into this smaller group of men about my age, I started to recognize a couple faces. Hananiah I knew really well. We were friends. We were friends from Jerusalem. And when we saw each other, we just embraced and couldn't believe that we were actually grouped together. Azariah and Daniel, also in our group, we had known each other because we were all Jews. We had known loosely of each other. But this huddle of a little slice of home, it brought such comfort into a place that was so strange. And us in our group, we just kind of stuck together as much as we could. We started learning the routine. We started learning the academic process and the expectations. And we were basically enrolled into the school of the Babylonian elite. So we started taking lectures from some of the lead astrologers. We started memorizing the names of the gods of the Babylonian pantheon. We started having, learning labs from retired military leaders and provincial rulers and authorities. We started understanding how the government of Babylon worked. And we did really well. Early on, when they were explaining the food program, Daniel stepped out and he walked directly to the chief of staff, and he went up to them, and we knew what he was going to do, and we couldn't believe he was actually doing it. He was clearly the leader among us in the type A, right up to the chief of staff, and said he didn't want to eat. In fact, he drug us into it too. He said, we don't want to eat the king's food. Can we do a diet that's different, more like what we want to do? And the chief of staff just shrugged him off. Of course he's not going to do that, especially for a group like us. We all but put Daniel in a headlock and said, shut up or we're dead. They behead people for stuff like that. Just stop putting us at risk. But he didn't quit. He went then to the attendant who looked over us on our food program, asked the same thing. Can we do a trial period? Can we have a different diet? And he said yes. So we had this own flexibility. We were able to eat what we wanted. We did well. And we excelled in the learning, and it was then that I first started to recognize maybe this just wasn't me. who was doing so well. Maybe this was some help, because it just flowed. And Daniel kind of got into a league of his own really quickly, but the other three, they gave us new names, and we became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we just rose like the cream to the top. Everything we did, we succeeded, and it became so common that the three of us were always together. We were tight, and it almost became like our three names were just one word: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When you called for one, you called for all three. We were always together: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Top of the class. So when we finally came to our exams, Nebuchadnezzar was actually there. I mean, he showed up. He was sitting a little bit in the distance, and he was higher than us, but he was there in person. I remember seeing him for the first time and thinking how tall he is, but thin, lanky. I expected this muscular, burly figure, but you could watch him and really quickly realize that his strength was not in his arms, it was in his will. You could see it in his eyes. That when he set his gaze to a region, they were as good as conquered. That when he took steps, you better not get in his way or you would be crushed and he would never look back. He watched as dozens of us were being examined. We gave speeches. We dealt with mathematical equations. We responded to questions and quizzing. And it just flowed. I was nervous, but it just flowed. So much so that Nebuchadnezzar stood up and came directly up. And he came to me first, and he put his hand on my shoulder. And then to Shadrach and Abednego. And he chose us, top of the class. We were immediately promoted. We moved into different regions, and we began to govern in a kingdom we didn't even love. We didn't choose. It chose us. I didn't get to see the other two very often. Our work separated us. But there was something strangely calm about that time. We were far away, but there was the blessing. There was some goodness. I just felt that for all that we had learned in Babylon, which was way beyond what we'd ever learned in Jerusalem, the things that we learned in Jerusalem, we held on to. And God was there. We didn't have the temple, we didn't have the priests, we didn't have the Torah, but I had some of it in here. And so every day I would kind of say it out loud. I would pray the prayers that I remembered. And I don't know if the priests would condemn me for thinking this way, but it was almost like I had this little temple right here. Almost like the tabernacle of Moses. He could kind of make it mobile. It was a traveling temple inside, and I just kind of invited God into that space, and I just kind of knew he was there. And all the things that were numb began to thaw. I met my wife in my region. She was also Jewish, which I took as more than a coincidence. There were not that many Jewish women. And so we met and we got married rather quickly. And then shortly after that, she became pregnant. She was sure it was a girl. I knew it was a boy. I knew he was going to be just like his dad. And so as her pregnancy continued, life was strangely settled in Babylon. That's when it started right there. It started with my assistant running in one day carrying a copy of a king's decree. And as he began reading it in a fast pace, halfway through, I knew what it meant. I knew where it was going. Babylon is the center of everything, and Nebuchadnezzar's in charge of the whole world. And Nebuchadnezzar is building a statue. He's building an idol And he's going to have this grand dedication ceremony, and every level of government that serves in his kingdom has to come and has to be a part of this dedication ceremony. I was reading clearly between the lines. We all knew what this meant. Nebuchadnezzar was a new king. He was a younger king, but he was ambitious, and he had conquered so many other people from so many different regions that there was just a smattering of people. Different religious backgrounds, different languages, different cultures, all with a loose loyalty. This statue represented a rallying point. It represented a moment of transition where you became obviously aligned to the throne. We saw this statue under construction. It was big. Just south of the city gates, it was 2 or 3 times taller than any other structure in the city. And it was totally covered in gold. And it was supposed to be the god Marduk, but if you looked at it carefully, you'd see a striking resemblance to Nebuchadnezzar. You just couldn't miss the connection, the face and the features and the beard. We knew what this meant. It meant total allegiance. I didn't know this at the time. But later, Daniel told us about a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that he interpreted. He said the dream was of a really big statue. And the statue had a head made of gold. And then the body parts and the legs and the feet were made of different materials. And the meaning of the dream was that the empire that Nebuchadnezzar led, the head of gold, represented his empire. That would give way, and then another empire would take over, and then that would give way, and ultimately that God was in charge of all these empires. Nebuchadnezzar had that dream, and yet months later, here he is building his own big statue, not with a head of gold, covered in gold. We heard it. His kingdom will last forever. His reign is supreme. When the dedication ceremony came, we all marched down to the plains. There's dozens and dozens of high-level officials, hundreds of workers who were required and demanded to be there, but then thousands of others who were just there to see what was happening and participate. Sun was just brilliant, reflecting off of the idol in every direction. And Nebuchadnezzar gave the decree again, and we all knew exactly what was going to happen. The full band, the full orchestra, they started playing, and at the cue, at the appointed time, everybody bowed, and they hit their knees, and they hit their foreheads to the ground, and there was like a wave of worship flowing toward this statue. But I just stood. I hadn't scripted it. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. It was more like I had made a decision as a kid. There was it was a turning point way before this, back in Jerusalem, where I had sort of settled the issue of who I worshiped, and it just kind of came out here. And everybody else was bowing, and it was like the whole world was just worshiping the wrong thing, and I knew I couldn't. Whatever it cost me, whatever was involved in the process, I just knew I couldn't. I had to do the right thing. You know what? It wasn't even doing the right thing. It was just not doing the wrong thing. And as I stood, I started to think what this might cost me. If Nebuchadnezzar saw, he would come and mow me down, and then he'd go straight for my family and destroy them the same day, and then he'd probably kill every Jew in the kingdom just to make a point. Before I could get too carried away with thoughts, I saw somebody else standing. I looked over to the other side, and there's Shadrach, looking eye to eye with me. We hadn't planned this. We hadn't coordinated. I hadn't seen him in a long time, but he's standing there. And then we looked over to the other side, and there's Abednego standing as well. And we all stand, And we didn't say anything from the distance, but we could recognize each other's faces, and there was a strange comfort flowing between the three of us. Whatever we were in this together. And then there was a moment of unrealistic optimism that just kind of charged, I think, all three of us, and a smile cracked, and we thought, maybe they won't notice. Maybe they won't see us. They're all facing. But they noticed. I saw heads turn while they were bowed. Some of the Chaldeans. As soon as the ceremony ended, they were straight to Nebuchadnezzar. They were telling him by name, the three of us who stood, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego clan. They were standing. They did not worship. We were bound and dragged before Nebuchadnezzar. Everybody was still there. Nobody had dismissed. Nothing had stopped. This just got added on to the processional. So we were standing before Nebuchadnezzar. And he looked at us and he didn't inquire. He didn't ask if it was true. He just wanted to give us a second chance. And so he said they would recreate the scene. And he said, when you hear the cue, as if we were ignorant, as if to give us the benefit, like we missed it the first time, he was going to give us a saving grace. And he said, when you hear the music and when you hear the cue, you better bow, or else you will be burned. And he turned to walk away to go give the signal. And there was something inside of me that rose up from a place I didn't even know where it was. And it was like time froze for just that 1 minute. And I recognized, you have those times in your life when you realize this is a defining moment. What I do right here will matter for the rest of my life. I can never get this moment back. It doesn't matter as much what I've said or done before or what I do after, but this is my time. And I just blurted out, Nebuchadnezzar. I couldn't believe among the three of us was the one. I was the least likely to say it, but he whipped around and he turned back and I could see the expression on his face. He expected fully to see us bowing and in humble submission before the music started. He expected his victory, but that's not what he got. We don't have to defend ourselves to you. The God that we worship is able to save us from your furnace. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know we will never bow and worship your gods. I barely finished the sentence when he blew a fuse. His face became red. He was so angry, he turned to the guards and had to choke the words out of his tight throat. Fire it up! And the furnace, the kiln was overflowing. It was just bursting flames. The flames were so high, it looked like it was going halfway up the knee of the idol, and it created this awesome dramatic scene, except I knew we were headed right for it. And the flames raged, and the guards dragged us off, and all of a sudden I realized I just spoke for my friends. I hope that's what they wanted to do too. So I just made them complicit in this whole thing. Maybe they were about to bow, but I don't think so. And we walked, and as we marched toward the flames, all I could think about was, how long will it hurt? How long will I burn before I black out? Isn't that a strange thing to think about on your last minute? It's all I could think about. And what my wife was going to name our son if he lived to see his birthday. As we walked toward the flames, each step brought a little bit more calm. I was surprised. And everybody else around, the entire mass of people who had just bowed their knees, watched at this sacrifice. We were about to be burned like incense at the feet of this massive statue of sticks and stones, and they all got a little nervous. But we were calm. And we walked like not men who were prisoners, but just like men. They took us to the top of the kiln, and they threw us in the opening, and we hit the ground. And for a moment, I thought we had died instantly because I couldn't feel a thing. But after a few seconds passed by, we realized we were not burning. We were not even in pain. The flames saw us coming, and they backed up. And it was still raging all around us, but there was like a space in between us. And I looked at my friends, and I looked at them, and they looked at me with just a sense of confusion on our face until we looked to the right, and there he was. His face was brighter than the flames. And it's not a face I'd seen before, but it's a face I knew. And we couldn't look right at it, but we knew him. This was the Holy One of Israel. This was him. This was the one who loved us. And that space that I had cultivated in my heart was flooded. And nobody spoke. He didn't say anything. We didn't say anything. But this was the moment to bow. This was the time where we just wanted to get on our faces and worship, because this was the one that we knew. We just stood. And there was this knowing. Without words, there's just this knowing going on. And all of a sudden, the flames became irrelevant. And the statue looking down upon it was ridiculous. And Nebuchadnezzar's rage and his army was inconsequential because we were standing. We were standing with him. Listen, I grew up in Jerusalem, and we always knew that was God's holy land. And we had the temple, and there was the Holy of Holies, and that was considered holy ground and sacred ground. But I'm telling you, when we stood in the fire, I knew that was holy ground. Because he was there. And I knew we were like marked men. Somehow, for all the generations before, and like the few who would come after us, somehow we were marked as those who were with him. Or with him. It was a great honor. And I knew that those who stand with him, he will stand with them. And that was the reward. We didn't want to leave. I don't know if we were in there for seconds or hours, but we didn't want to be anywhere else. A crackling voice broke the moment. It was Nebuchadnezzar with a tremble in his tone. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of the flames. We walked out of the side opening of the kiln, and we walked up. And as we approached Nebuchadnezzar, the guards were lined up beside us, and they started parting ways, and their jaws were dropping because they could see we were not burned. Not a hair on our beards was smoking. And we were glowing, not with pride. And we walked up to Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't seem quite as tall as last time. And we stood before him, and we didn't have to. I could see it in his face. It was kind of shaking. The fire had changed him. I could see it in these massive people who still had grass stains on their knees. The fire had changed them and me. Nothing was the same. It was the same outside, but not in. I went home that night. I went home like a normal day of work. Can you imagine me trying to tell my wife at the dinner table when she said, "How was your day?" Took me a while. She tried to get me to quit my job, change careers, and it's an occupational hazard living in Babylon. You just have to face these things. I just want you to remember this. I just want you to remember this. God did not save us from the fire. He was with us in the fire.